serial killers who remain uncaptured. According to the FBI, there could be as many as 50 active serial killers operating in the United States at this very moment. That's essentially one serial killer per state across the nation. For this year's Halloween special, I knew I wanted to explore the topic of serial killers, but I also wanted to make it particularly unsettling. That's why I chose to focus not on serial killers we all recognize who've been imprisoned or executed, but rather on serial killers who are currently active or still at large today. Being at large and being active are two distinct things, which is why this video functions as something of a two-part feature. I'm going to begin by examining every serial killer who continues to walk among us, and then I'm going to escalate to serial killers who are not only at large, but actively killing to this very day. So without further delay, let's discuss killers who could theoretically harm you. The year is 1992. You're the manager working at a neighborhood shoe store, and you've just started your shift. Today seemed like any ordinary day. You were alone in the store and business was quiet. That was until one peculiar individual entered. He walks into the store looking directly at you and remains mostly silent. However, he asks if you could locate something for him in the stockroom. You comply and head to the back, only to discover you've been followed. Before you can comprehend what's happening, you hear the click of a firearm and your life flashes before your eyes. Tragically, this is the actual story of one of the I-70 killer's victims. And this victim was one of several. The I-70 killer earned his name from the I-70 highway because every single murder attributed to him occurred just miles from this interstate. For those unfamiliar, the I-70 highway is one of the longest interstates in the entire United States, stretching from Utah to Maryland. That fact alone is intriguing and we'll revisit it shortly, but let's focus on the killer himself. It's believed the I-70 killer was most active from 1992 until 1994, though murders as recent as 2001 have also been linked to him. Very little is known about this individual, and every murder associated with him shares an extremely consistent pattern. Nearly every victim of the I-70 killer matches the same profile. The victim was a woman working alone in a retail establishment just miles off the I-70 highway, and was methodically executed with a .22 caliber bullet to the back of the head. Interestingly, all murders attributed to the I-70 killer showed minimal to no evidence of assault or theft following the killing. This suggests the killer likely murdered purely for the gratification of killing. Which only further proves, in case you weren't already convinced, that this person is deeply disturbed. It's important to note there are a few murders from the I-70 killer that deviate from the pattern. Specifically, a few murders involving male victims, as well as an incident where two people were murdered simultaneously, which was the first and only time that occurred. Authorities theorize the I-70 killer believed one employee was alone, when in fact both the employee and store owner were present at the location, and the I-70 killer decided to eliminate both individuals. As of today, there are believed to be anywhere from 6 to over 9 murders attributed to the I-70 killer. Interestingly, with these murders occurring relatively recently, and the significant number of victims, there's actually considerable evidence and information available. Yet remarkably, even with the technology that existed in the early 1990s, and the far more advanced technology available today, there's still absolutely no indication of who the I-70 killer might be. All we possess are a few composite sketches based on eyewitness descriptions. My mind is still somewhat blown that with over 6 active crime scenes that have all been remarkably consistent in a relatively modern era, we still have virtually no concrete information, and it appears we may never obtain any. Witnesses who claim to have encountered the I-70 killer described a thin white male, approximately 5 feet 7 inches to 5 feet 9 inches tall, in his 20s to 30s at the time. Law enforcement agencies across the United States continue actively investigating the true identity of the I-70 killer to finally bring him to justice. Today, investigators believe the I-70 killer is likely between 52 and 70 years old, meaning it's highly probable he's still alive and moving freely among society today. Though it's suspected he's either ceased killing or simply modified his methods so his recent murders cannot be connected to his now notorious persona. The I-70 killer isn't the only killer of this type. There's also an I-70 strangler and an I-65 killer. But even those aren't all of them. In a press release, the FBI explicitly stated that a disproportionate number of murderers and serial killers have been truck drivers, simply because their lifestyle is remarkably conducive to serial killing. They're constantly traveling city to city, frequenting transient locations like rest stops and gas stations, and they always have a legitimate reason to be somewhere. And truck drivers and their vehicles for the most part, operate under the radar. Regarding the I-70 killer specifically, authorities don't know what his occupation was. However, they believe he was either a truck driver, a drifter, or someone who traveled I-70 frequently for work. Well, all I can say is if you're traveling on I-70 and encounter a man resembling this description, maintain your distance. The year is 2006. You and your dog are staying in an inexpensive motel outside Atlantic City because you've experienced financial hardship. You decide to take your daily walk. You walk your dog along the usual route around the motel when you notice your dog is particularly interested in something behind the building. He keeps attempting to lead you down to a drainage ditch. While you're reluctant to go down there, you sense something suspicious is occurring. You return to your room and contact police. After they arrive, they knock on your door and inform you that what you reported was extremely concerning. What was discovered in that drainage ditch was profoundly disturbing. Inside that drainage ditch lay 4 deceased women. All the women found in the ditch were identified as sex workers in the area. And all these women were positioned extremely methodically. These women were all face down in the drainage ditch, roughly 6 feet apart from each other. All their heads were pointed eastbound. And all were fully clothed except their socks and shoes had been removed. And all were strangled to death. The manner in which these women were killed and how their bodies were discovered is naturally where the rather disturbing name Eastbound Strangler originated. Essentially everything I've just shared is nearly everything currently known about the Eastbound Strangler. Unfortunately, that simply comes with the territory when discussing serial killers who remain at large. They're at large for a reason. It's because limited information is known, or at least insufficient to locate them, let alone prosecute them. Unfortunately, this leaves considerable room for speculation. I would argue that if this serial killer possessed sufficient strength to strangle and relocate the bodies of 4 women into a ditch, then they likely weren't extremely elderly when these killings occurred. And because these killings happened only 19 years ago, I'd say it's highly likely that whoever killed these 4 women is still alive today and possibly still active. Because all 4 murders were only connected because all the bodies were found in the same location. But if this killer chose to go anywhere else in the country and kill someone in any other manner, well, nobody would really suspect the Eastbound Strangler. Fortunately, the Jeff Davis 8 situation has considerable information surrounding it. However, this information, while disturbing, only generates more questions than answers. The Jeff Davis 8, or the Jennings 8, refers to a series of murders that occurred between 2005 and 2009 in the small town of Jennings, Louisiana. All 8 of the Jeff Davis 8 victims were women. But more significantly, they were also connected to each other. Not only did they all live in similar circumstances, being young women struggling with poverty, drug addiction, and prostitution, but they also literally knew each other. Several victims in this case were also police informants. And some of these informants even provided information about each other to the same police department. And that police department is something we'll discuss momentarily. All 8 women were killed in similar ways and disposed of in similar locations. The murder methods included strangulation, suffocation, or drowning. And the areas where these bodies were dumped were either swamps or canals in remote areas outside Jennings. It's reported that when these bodies were discovered, evidence showed an active attempt to render these bodies unidentifiable once found. It's also suggested that whoever placed these bodies in these extremely remote locations was very familiar with the local terrain due to how specific these locations were and how difficult they were to access. Initially, this case sounds like any of our other cases. Certainly, a group of women were unfortunately killed and went missing because they lived in vulnerable situations and were targeted by psychopaths seeking to kill innocent people. But once you examine this case more closely, you realize that while there very likely could have been a serial killer who murdered these 8 women, it's also highly suspected that there was some police involvement. And theories about this police involvement vary drastically. Some people believe local authorities actually executed the planning, killing, and concealment of these women's bodies, while others suspect the local police were simply complicit in the situation and didn't invest much effort into investigating simply because of who the victims were. Whether you believe the Jeff Davis 8 killer was a single serial killer or potentially a group of people involved in law enforcement, the same conclusion can be drawn. Nobody has ever been charged for the murders of these 8 women. And unfortunately, it appears nobody ever will. This means that the individual or individuals who killed these 8 women are definitely at large and walking among us today. To me, this is another case that seems so peculiar because there were literally 8 murders that occurred over 4 years in extremely modern history. We're talking 2005 to 2009. The technology wasn't where it is now, but it was definitely advanced enough to make some progress on this. So the fact that 8 murders can occur in 4 years in the exact same place and nothing ever results from it is extremely suspicious. Which is why, for that reason, I don't think examining law enforcement more closely is unreasonable. If you watch some of the documentaries or read some of the books about the situation, you'll definitely gain a deeper perspective on the potential law enforcement involvement. The West Mesa Bone Collector. The year is 2009. You're an avid outdoorsman. This time, you decide something that could be interesting to try is testing your survival skills in the desert. That's when you decide to try living off the land in Albuquerque's West Mesa. You spend your first day on the trip hiking and becoming familiar with the landscape. Until, while hiking through a mesa, you notice something protruding from the ground. It doesn't resemble a flower or cactus. As you approach closer, you realize this is a bone. But it doesn't look like any animal bone you've ever seen. And you realize that what you're observing is a human bone. Naturally, you contact the police immediately, who arrive on the scene to confirm what you found was, in fact, human remains. Then, over the following weeks, something happens that horrifies the entire city of Albuquerque. They unearth not just one set of remains, but 11 separate bodies. Every single one of these victims was female, and nearly everyone was a sex worker who had gone missing between 2001 and 2005. The location where these bodies were found is now known as the West Mesa Burial Site, and the killer was given the name, the West Mesa Bone Collector. Now, as a disturbing coincidence, every single one of these victims was discovered in the exact same area, buried in shallow graves. The bodies were all covered by the dry desert sand, which had helped preserve them for several years. All of the women had vanished from the same general part of Albuquerque, the area near Central Avenue, which is known for prostitution and drug activity. Authorities were certain the same person was responsible for all of these killings. But to this day no one has been arrested. The main suspect in the case was a man named Lorenzo Montoya. Montoya lived less than 3 miles from the burial site and was known to solicit sex workers in the area. He also matched witness descriptions of someone seen with several of the missing women before their disappearances. However, in 2006, years before the bodies were found, Montoya was killed by the boyfriend of a woman he had kidnapped and strangled in his home. After Montoya's death, the disappearances of sex workers in the area appeared to stop. This led many investigators to believe Montoya may have been the West Mesa Bone Collector. But here's the problem: there's never been any physical evidence tying him directly to the murders. None of the DNA, none of the personal belongings, nothing. Just coincidence and speculation. So while it's entirely possible that Montoya was the killer, it's equally possible that the real West Mesa Bone Collector is still alive and free to this very day. The Long Island Serial Killer. The next case is probably the most famous unsolved serial killer case in modern American history, the Long Island Serial Killer, also known as LISK. Everything began in May of 2010, when a 911 dispatcher in Long Island received a call from a terrified young woman named Shannon Gilbert. During the call, which lasted 22 minutes, Shannon repeatedly screamed that someone was trying to kill her. Police searched for hours that night but found nothing. Then, 7 months later, during a training exercise with a police dog, officers discovered a set of human remains near Gilgo Beach. Over the next several days they found more, a total of 10 bodies in that same area, all buried in similar fashion along a stretch of Ocean Parkway. All of the victims were women, all of them were sex workers, and all had advertised their services on Craigslist. Most were wrapped in burlap and disposed of in nearly identical ways. At first, police thought they had stumbled upon a dumping ground for multiple killers. But after studying the evidence, they realized the consistency of the victims and the disposal method meant they were almost certainly dealing with a single individual, the Long Island Serial Killer. For over a decade the case went cold. Investigators had DNA samples, cell phone pings, and countless leads, but no arrests. Then, in 2023, more than a decade later, there was a massive breakthrough. A man named Rex Hoyerman, a 59-year-old architect from Massapequa Park, was arrested and charged with several of the Gilgo Beach murders. His DNA matched hair found on the burlap used to wrap the victims, and his phone records connected him to burner phones used to contact the women. Police believe Hoyerman may be responsible for many more murders that haven't yet been linked to him, both in New York and possibly across the United States. While this is the first time we've seen an arrest in the Gilgo Beach case, it's still uncertain whether Hoyerman acted alone, or whether there could still be another Long Island serial killer operating out there. The smiley face killer theory. Now we're entering one of the most debated theories in modern criminology, the smiley face killer. The term, smiley face killer, doesn't actually refer to a single known individual. Instead, it's a theory proposed by retired detectives Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte, who believe that dozens of deaths across the U.S., originally labeled as accidental drownings, were actually homicides connected by a single or organized group of killers. The pattern started to emerge in the late 1990s. Young, college-aged men, often athletic, good students and heavy drinkers, would disappear after a night out. Days or weeks later, their bodies would be found in nearby rivers or lakes, often showing signs inconsistent with drowning. What really tied these cases together were the eerie smiley face graffiti symbols found near many of the discovery sites. The theory suggests that a network of individuals, or perhaps a cult, is kidnapping, torturing and killing these young men, leaving the smiley face as a calling card. However, the FBI and most law enforcement agencies officially reject this theory, claiming there's no conclusive evidence of a serial killer or organized group. They maintain that the drownings are tragic but accidental, typically the result of intoxication and misadventure. Still, the sheer number of similar cases and the repeated presence of the smiley face symbol has left many convinced there's something much darker going on. If the smiley face killers are real, it would make them one of the most widespread and elusive serial killer networks in history. The Colonial Parkway Murders. Between 1986 and 1989, 8 people, 4 couples, were brutally murdered along a 22-mile stretch of scenic road known as the Colonial Parkway in Virginia. All of the victims were young couples parked in secluded areas, usually in their cars. The killer would approach, often pretending to be law enforcement before attacking. Each scene was unique but shared haunting similarities. The victims were either shot, strangled, or had their throats cut. Their cars were sometimes burned and personal belongings were missing. Despite extensive investigation by both the FBI and local authorities, no one has ever been arrested. Some theories suggest the killer may have been a law enforcement officer or someone posing as one, given that many victims appear to have trusted the perpetrator enough to roll down their windows or exit their vehicles willingly. There's even speculation that this killer could have continued operating beyond Virginia, possibly connecting to other unsolved Lovers Lane murders across the East Coast. Decades later, DNA evidence is still being processed, but so far nothing definitive has emerged. The Colonial Parkway killer remains unidentified, and possibly still alive. The Highway of Tears. This next one takes us to Canada, specifically, a 720-kilometer stretch of Highway 16 between Prince George and Prince Rupert, British Columbia. Since 1970, over 40 women, many of them Indigenous, have vanished or been found murdered along this highway. Local communities call it the Highway of Tears. Most of the victims were last seen hitchhiking. Poverty, lack of public transportation, and systemic neglect forced many women to rely on strangers for rides, and many never returned. Canadian authorities have linked at least a dozen of these murders to known offenders, but the vast majority remain unsolved. Families and activists believe multiple serial killers have used the remote and isolated highway to target vulnerable women with impunity. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that law enforcement ignored the crisis for decades, dismissing many disappearances as runaways or drug-related cases. In recent years, Canada's National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women confirmed what locals had known all along, that racism, sexism, and indifference allowed these killings to continue unchecked for generations. Even today, as you drive along the Highway of Tears, you'll see signs that read "Girls, don't hitchhike, a killer may be on the loose." It's a chilling reminder that the danger is not just history, it's still very real. Conclusion. If there's one thing that unites all of these cases, it's the terrifying idea that evil doesn't always have a face you can recognize, or a name you can look up. The killers behind these stories aren't characters in a movie. They're people who live in neighborhoods, drive on highways, walk through stores, and blend into crowds like anyone else. And the scariest part? Many of them could still be out there. Maybe you've passed one at a gas station. Maybe you've stood next to one in line. Maybe they're still hunting, waiting, and watching for their next victim. Sleep tight.